All right, so here we are. We are in Chapter 3, Through the Hacker's Lens, Cyber Threats, Vulnerabilities, and Attacks. This chapter has 5 parts to the lecture. We're going to get started with the first part, which, of course, if you've watched any of the others, you know we start with a bit of history. We need to know from where we came to understand where we are now and to look at where this whole cybersecurity threats, vulnerabilities, etc. can go. Okay, and when I talk about can go, I'm talking about the utilization of artificial intelligence, large language models, and eventually, very soon, by the way, quantum computing and its impact on cybersecurity, both from an attack, right, as well as from a defense. So a couple just reiterations from things we've talked about before. We talked about Bob Thomas. We talked about the creeper virus. Okay, still, known as the first known computer virus. That leads us to the Morris worm. We've also talked about that, so I won't spend much time. One of the first worms distributed on the internet, right? Demonstrating the potential for widespread disruption. And boy, have there been following worms that have made this one look mild as it pertains to disruption of computer networks. So legal framework, 1986, right? So Congress passes the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and literally just 4 years later, okay, now think about how long some of these acts never go amended, but this act gets amended 4 years later to address computer crime, right? To address computer crime. So, this is what led to Robert Morris being able to be prosecuted under the CFAA, that led to, of course, his guilty plea. Of course, he didn't do time, as we discussed. He got parole, so he kind of got off lucky, right? And this was back in a time when there was some innocence to what was going on in the fact that what could we do with the internet? How could we create these malicious pieces of software, right? So that brings us, or skyrockets us, to 4 years to the 1990s. And we see the Solar Sunrise attack, which targeted the U.S. military computers, demonstrated the potential for cyber war. And we'll get more into that. We get into that in the textbook if you're also reading the textbook. So evolution of malware, take us to the 2000s. Boy, we're just jumping decades. Boom, just like that, right? And we have the infamous I Love You virus. Okay, so this was the big, hello everyone, let me mess up your email. Okay, so it was an email-based malware causing billions in damage. Okay, now, they're talking about everything, right? Not just the base damage, but the time it took to fix, the time it took to mitigate, all of that stuff, right? Comes from this simple virus connected to email, started the whole click process. So 2003, we see the SQL Slammer worm targeting vulnerabilities in Microsoft SQL Server. We're going to talk about a SQL injection towards the end of this video series for Chapter 3. So hang out. We will get there, right? This highlighted the need for patch management. And the reason for this was, as we'll see, a lot of the viruses that came about and created all this damage, even though Microsoft and other vendors had patches out that fixed the vulnerability that the hackers used to create all of this havoc, right? So it's out. So patch management becomes huge, and it is a key point today in any IT department, making sure we're patching quickly, of course, with all the challenges that come with patching, which is, what if we apply a patch that breaks something, unintendedly, right? How do we undo that patch? And how long do we give it before we patch, just in case there are issues, right? And that's really independent. It really can depend on your company. It can depend on the risk tolerance of the company. We're going to spend a whole chapter in risk. It can depend on that risk tolerance of the company, and it can depend on their vulnerability, right? So if it's a large target with a lot of attack vector, boy, patching becomes much more important. Now, for this next section, we are going to actually use Stuxnet, okay, as some examples when we talk about the kill chain, okay, and I think it's part 2 of this series for chapter 3. So Stuxnet, right? First weaponized cyber attack targeting industrial control systems, right? Specifically Iran's nuclear facilities. There's a little case study in the textbook to read. There's, as I'm going to show you, there is an absolutely great book on this as well. Be familiar with Stuxnet, especially when you find out who was the nation state or states that are said to be responsible for Stuxnet. That might surprise you. So 2013 Target data breach exposed millions of customers' credit card information through what? Right? Through a supply chain. That was the key here. So it was vulnerabilities in a vendor system that led them in, got them into Target, gives them access to these secure payment systems. So finally, advanced persistent threats come around. Ransomware in 2003, the Titan Rain campaign by China, right? So Chinese-based hackers, as it said, state-sponsored, or what I like to call nation-state-sponsored, so there's no confusion. APT targets the U.S. government, right? And that is still happening today. Recording this video, 2024, middle of 2024, we're finding more places that the Chinese, have gotten into vulnerable systems. Especially the focus right now is on, the power grid, water supply systems, all of that good stuff that were typically targets, right? In war, in previous wars, these were the things. You took out the infrastructure. You took out the communications infrastructure. You took out water. You took out power, right? So how do we do that from a digital standpoint? And how do we find those ways in and remain hidden, as we'll see, right? So APTs, as it says, advanced persistent threats. These are threats where, a lot of times it's organized crime. It's definitely nation state actors that are finding their way in. They remain in the system, okay? A lot of times having that 0 day that they can take advantage if needed, okay? Fast forward 2017, I'm sure most of you, if you're interested at all in information technology, web development, computer science, programming, and cybersecurity, you've heard of the WannaCry ransomware, right? So, global impact, highlighting ransomware attacks. What do we know about it? Well, there's one right there where, granted, there was, in fact, a patch, right? So, the WannaCry ransom virus primarily took advantage, okay, of Windows operating systems, okay, and a vulnerability known as Eternal Blue. And when you do some reading, you'll find out what Eternal Blue was, okay? But, basically targeted the SMB, the Server Message Block Protocol, all right? Now, what's interesting is that the vulnerability that WannaCry took advantage of, okay, was patched on March 14th of 2017, and WannaCry wasn't unleashed till May 12th, 2017. So the key is that the vulnerability that it took advantage of, Microsoft had released a patch MS17-010 for all you really technical nerds, that addressed the SMB vulnerability, all right? The big issue was, A, systems weren't patched, and B, the biggest attack vector was Windows XP, which was no longer supported by Microsoft. Thus, the patch wouldn't have been applied because there wasn't a patch issued for that version of the operating system. All right? So, but what Microsoft did, this was such a big deal, especially in Europe, that Microsoft went back and issued a patch and made it available for an unsupported operating system. That's how crazy the WannaCry ransomware virus is. So that takes us to 2020 and SolarWinds. That cyber attack, this was a highly sophisticated APT, okay, targeting various organizations, through the software, through the supply chain, right, that led to hundreds of millions of dollars. Because when we talk about the impact of ransomware, it's just not about paying, right? It's about getting the data back, restoring data, restoring systems that may have been compromised, if not all of the systems, all that labor, not to mention those are tangible costs. Then we have the untangible cost of, customer trust with us managing their data, etc. Okay. And it's hard to put a price on that. So moving forward, high profile attacks and trends in recent years. Well, 2021, Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. So this is a fuel supplier in the East Coast, major fuel supplier for gas stations in the East Coast, right? Suddenly they can't do anything. They can't deliver gas. They can't track their inventory. They don't know who gets what, etc. So what do they end up doing? They end up paying the ransom. Now, it could be, theoretically, it could be that Colonial Pipeline was ready for a ransomware attack. They had backups. They had air gaps. They had everything going on. But the cost it would take and the time was more than just paying the $4.4 million ransom, getting that de-encryption key, getting back up and running, and then having the time to assess and restore the servers so that they didn't get hit with ransomware again. Now, if you'll notice, you very seldom hear about a company that gets hit twice. And the reason being is if companies got hit multiple times, people would stop paying the ransom. What makes ransomware profitable for these organized crime groups is that people pay, right? Companies aren't prepared. And we're going to see this, I think, really start stemming down from, large municipalities, cities, etc., large companies, down to small companies that get hit with this next, right? That need to make those payments. So, countermeasures. Well, in 1990, all this stuff happens and we started implementing countermeasures. So in the 90s, it was about firewalls. It was about antivirus software on your servers, antivirus software on clients, on phones, etc. Somewhat of protection, right? Microsoft comes in with Defender. It improves Defender so that at least in the Windows operating system, there's some sort of default antivirus. Okay. 2000s develop of IDS and IPS, intrusion detection. We're going to get deeper into that in a future chapter. So just stick with those terms. Just think intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. For now, 2010, adoption of advanced threat intelligence, machine learning comes into play. We start analyzing networks that we know aren't compromised, that we know are clean. We know what data typically flows over what subnets, over what data, across what firewalls into the DMZ, into our private network, through our Wi-Fi, etc. And then, if there's an abnormality, the system uses AI to figure out what the abnormality is, what devices are affected, and then, like a security operations center would address it to figure out, is it an attack? Or is it just a new piece of software or an update in a software that created unique or new traffic that isn't part of their, air quotes, baseline, right? 2020, emphasis on zero trust. We're going to talk about that. Zero trust is a methodology, a framework. Basically, you don't trust anybody. Authenticate everything. Authenticate computer to computer, user into the VPN. You name it, we authenticate it. Nothing gets trusted or to access our network, and nothing gets trusted within our network either, right? So finally, let's end this first session, our little history, with a recommended reading. If you are interested in really learning the history, this is a great book. It tends to be on the top 10, top 15 list of books that any cybersecurity professional should read. This is by Jim Zetter. It's called Countdown to Zero Day. And as you can see, it details Stuxnet and the launch of the world's first digital weapon. Now, if you don't have time to read, there is Audible, and there's also a great free documentary. I think it's on Netflix. in regards to Stuxnet that will give you some of the information, although this book is a great read and really goes into it in detail. All right, so that's it for this part. Next part, part 2, we are going to look at cyber attack lifecycle. It's called the kill chain. We're going to look at the 8 steps. Sometimes people say 7 steps. I like the 8th step as well, which is covering your tracks essentially. And we'll talk about that in the next video. See you there.